I really love the work of Roxane Gay, if some of you may know this person, who I believe it was a joke, first of all, called herself, and in the TED Talk, a bad feminist, because it's really pressuring to perform in a perfect sense of way, to be the perfect feminist. It's not possible. We all have the cognitive dissonances. We all have ambiguities, inner ambiguities. And I think it must be something you enjoy. It should empower you. It should not overload you and your life with a set of rules, so to limit your possibilities. Second of all, I think my concept of feminism is influenced by the work of Donna Haraway as well, who once talked about the so-called God trick. So the notion of some people, in the past it was mostly white men, who said, like, my concept, my worldview is something objective, it's not subjective. I do not have to speak from my point of view, but I speak as a kind of goddish moment. And I think this is something, as a feminist futurist, I always want to ask, like, who is speaking about whom, who is part of the conversation, who is patronized, what kinds of questions are raised and what not. So it's all about the deconstruct our worldview, be open to learn, be open to let go of your own privileges, and sometimes you're wrong. And I think that's very, very important to say, that it's not about having the truth or finding the truth. It's about a work in progress, as I stated in the beginning. So I'm looking very much forward to this discussion. Thank you so much for this question.
Thank you so much, Franziska. Yeah, funny enough, Eva, I have a consultancy called Feminist Futures. So I definitely identify myself as a feminist futurist, an intersectional feminist, definitely. Because to me, I think feminism is a nice framework of a desirable future, right? Where we can really like nourish our ancestral knowledge at the same time that we can envision things that we never got to experience in this planet before, and really challenging the power dynamics and all the status quo and patriarchy and coloniality and racism and so many other issues that goes in my understanding or in my effect beyond just gender or women and men and sex in general. But yeah, I'm very, very excited to about this discussion as well. So yeah, even though I mean, I understand that you don't identify as a feminist, but nourish feminist principles to some extent. How do you apply feminism or feminist principles or even other principles in your work as a feminist? I know that decoloniality is something that is very strong for you in a mark of your work. How do you reconcile futures and foresight with this this framework and this paradigm?
Allow me to maybe clarify something that I've said earlier. I do identify as a feminist. My point was to say that in the way I frame my futures work, the main label that is going to be applied on me is not necessarily the label as a feminist futurist. And so that is the point that I'm making here, is also because I want to be honest to the literature that I might be quoting. And so this forms of hesitancy that I have to make sure that, you know, I know also where I lay actually resonates very well with some work of like, well, some of the work that, for example, Ivana has been Ivana Milosevic has been pushing forward, which is also this idea of making sure that we also exercise a certain forms of doubt in the way we approach things. So that was where I was coming from. And so that does allow me to answer your question. In terms of the principles, so I did talk about this idea of relatability and seeking connection. What I found to be interesting when we're talking about feminism, and I think you made a point that speaks to me very much, Thays, earlier, which was this idea of frameworks. And so your point was to say the reason why you label yourself as a feminist futurist is because feminism offers a framework that allows for you to speak to the different not only themes, but also approaches to the world that you find to be of interest. And so then your question to me, and interpret it the same way as I interpreted your response to your question earlier, which is in what way does the framework I evolve in allow me to actually connect with feminist principles? And so that's how I'm going to answer your question. For me, there is an attention to the particular that I find to be very much special and specific to a feminist quest. I'll give you a series of different examples, but since I don't know how much time I have, I don't think I have many. So I'll just like stick to one project that I really like that I think really connects well with that. It was a project that we had in Lebanon that was basically originally for a Syrian NGO. So an NGO that was led by Syrian humanitarian migrants based in Lebanon. Now, their aim was actually to support Syrian humanitarian migrants like themselves. But what was interesting was to see that there was already a frame with which they were working, which was to actually support the return of Syrian refugees back to Syria. So there was an interesting assumption that was at play. But the way we were able to actually see that there was this assumption came from the participants themselves and the type of narratives that they had to push. So the stories that were coming from mothers talking about them returning to Syria, if it was a way for them to actually seek different forms of possibilities for their own family. And so from that perspective, we got to understand, wait a minute, maybe there's something that we're assuming and that we're not naming in the room. And what was interesting was what followed that project, because we could have continued to do the project at an NGO level or at a governmental level to then push, for a further challenge to that particular narrative, saying, well, if we're assuming something about people's desire to return, maybe we should also make sure that this crumbles directly at a policy level. And maybe we should have. But what was interesting is this project was actually influenced by two other women, one being from Syria herself and being a humanitarian migrant in Lebanon, and the other one being a German scholar who was the one who alerted me to that, or actually got me to join in the project. And what was really interesting about it was how, for them, the direction was not necessarily policy. It could eventually turn to policy, but there was a matter of urgency that was in the particular, that was in what families wanted to make for themselves with regards to their own situation as humanitarian migrants in Lebanon. And so what I like about this idea of saying like urgency of the particular might sound a little bit bizarre in many different ways, because we do know that there's a series also of feminist principles that are not about urgency and very much about the opposite of that, about a certain form of slowness that is associated to it. And there is also a critique of the particular as being too exceptional to be generalized. And so from that perspective, from a scientific perspective or from a policy perspective, we're like, what do we do with particular stories, like if they're particular? But what was interesting was actually to let the flow of the particular guide the general and guide actually what could come from a policy perspective, and to actually let that form of urgency, rather than actually imposing a certain form of slowness, allowed, that urgency to be expressed and see where it takes us, because that urgency also had different layers. Working with a family, families have different times. Even the different family members have different temporalities to them. And so that did allow us to then come at the end of the project and actually question this narrative of the migrant, to understand that, yes, there's a reason why states are pushing for migrants to go back where they come from, based on this idea that a migrant is somebody who cannot go back to where they come from due to reasons that exceed their will. And so then from that perspective, there's a series of different narratives that are built on that. But to then understand what could be a place of possibility could not be coming from that very same definition. it needed to be coming from the people who actually are empowered them to actually express themselves, to say, okay, well, if you ask me, allow me to actually propose my idea of the particular, and then see how those ideas connect. And then we got beautiful ideas of actually setting some kind of not a retirement camp, but like senior citizens coming together to actually in Syria, welcoming from time to time people of Syrian descent who just wanted to have a go. So it was not this idea of a permanent return, but having the possibility to return. And so it allows us to provide a lot more flexibility, a lot more nuances to a definition. And so once again, this idea of urgency of the particular is a key principle that I see reflected quite nicely in some of my futures project.
Thank you. That's a really beautiful example. Thank you so much, Eva. I would like to welcome Namatai as well. Hi, Namatai. So good to have you here. Please let us know if you can hear us.
Thank you. I can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. So we started this conversation just a minute ago, and we were asking each other our definitions of feminism in the first place, and then how do you apply feminist principles into your work? So maybe I'll go to you, and then I come back to Franziska.
Okay, fantastic. Is there a time regime of how much we can speak preliminarily, or like I could just go ahead because I had prepared something?
Sure. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. So thanks very much, ladies. And I'm really, really grateful to have this opportunity to be speaking here today and to be connecting with feminists at a time in the world where there is a very strong ongoing anti-feminist, anti-gender, anti-equality movement that is definitely well-sponsored, that is definitely backed by a lot of capitalism, a lot of patriarchy. And I think reflecting about that, especially during Women's Month, is something that's really good, so that we can have an immense dissection of, feminism and what the feminist movement can do to stay alive and to stay strong in such difficult times. So today, I just wanted to touch on a number of issues and not really major on the definitional, very much academic, theoretical aspects, but to talk about the very much practical aspects of what feminist futures means, and also what are some of the things that are happening in the world as we speak, and what we can do as sisters to converge and to push back and to preserve the movement. So, feminism, I think, as is defined generally, it is this radical idea of the social, economic, and political emancipation of the sexes, right? So it's not just about man, women. It's about the sexes, and I think that it's important for us to appreciate that it is a broad concept, and there are generally people that are pushing back against that, but that's something that we have to echo out in the room. Now, as a young Black female African feminist, there has been a lot of conversations that have come in about intersectionality, even within the confines of the feminist movement. And scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw have put these forward to talk about intersectionality, which is the idea that we could all be feminist, but we are starting off from a very different place. So if you grew up in Africa, for instance, there are aspects of colonization. If you're Black, there are aspects of race. If you are coming in from a particular nationality, that also affects. So these are some of the intersectional lenses that we can view the feminist conversation from. So I'm not going to go down that path of defining all of those things. I just want to touch on some critical issues that I think are important for our reflection when we think about feminist futures, because they would define what in this moment as feminists we must do to take us into the future. So the first thing is to be conscious of the anti-feminist and anti-gender movements that are well-funded and well-coordinated. Well-sponsored, globalized movements of anti-feminist and anti-gender are increasingly becoming well-funded and strategically coordinated, and they wield disproportionate, significant political, religious, and also media power. So they are basically now in a place where they are shaping the narrative. I mean, critical examples are, far-right political parties that we've seen in places like Poland, Hungary, Brazil, the United States even. And religious fundamentalists have also now gained a lot of political power in the men's rights movement as well. We must understand that they have a lot of impact because they are being backed by a lot of capital, where we've got wealthy individuals and corporations who benefit from the preservation of patriarchal systems, funding such things as anti-abortion organizations and LGBTQ plus laws. And these people are increasing their political influence. Politicians and organizations use these movements to gain power and often advocate.
Namatai, I think we lost you. Okay, let's see if she comes back. Meanwhile, Franziska, would you like to? Yeah, I think she will be dropped.
I can jump in until
yeah,
she's back.
sure.
Maybe we can kind of improvise here. Okay. I would love to refer to one thing Namatai just said. She said we have to prepare ourselves for the anti-feminist movement, which is well organized, which is well funded nowadays. It's not something like an add-on, something for some privileged people to like surround themselves in feminist circuits, but we must build a kind of strong, well-funded movement ourselves. And I think when I look, for example, at the debate culture, at the discussions nowadays, when it comes to politics, when it comes to different agendas, there's a kind of staying in your filter bubble, staying in your self-reference, which is not good, I think, in terms of the common goals of feminists or of anti-right movement, if you want so. And I think it should be important for everyone who's, I don't know if it's the label like left or human-centered or whatever, or Democrat, but to really focus on common goals instead of diverse agendas. And I think this is a very important feminist principle to kind of stay in the debate, like be open for the plurality of different concepts, focus on common goals. It's not about saying yes and be d'accord to everyone's opinion, but it's about not to stick to your own bubble and be kind of, how do you say so, tolerant to the ambiguous. You know what I mean? And I think she raised a very important thought there to really be, it's not about like the academic filter bubble when it comes to feminism. It's about a real threat to all of our rights here. And it's not only the women's or the queer rights, but of course, this is, if you want to refer to them as groups, there's always the marginalized perspectives. Yeah. I don't know if you have something to add, Eva.
On that, I hear you. I would not necessarily be more afraid. What I really like about different movements that have preceded us is very much the fact that they've always been targeted. And so they were not necessarily working around the idea of being targeted as being their 10 point. Oh, I would say they worked from there. That was already the system. There was never a point when they were actually welcome. And so when you actually come from a place of, great hostility, you work a bit differently. So from that perspective, I definitely hear you. And I do believe that it's something that is important in terms of, preparing different angles. I would say that we should not forget that our work was always around an idea of liberation. And there's, for example, something that I really liked about actually a proposal that comes from a decolonial approach, but as you can see, I believe that once again, those principles are actually speaking to one another anyway. It comes from what has been labeled as decolonial ecology by Malcolm Ferdinand. in his work, basically starts from the standpoint where he found to be very bizarre that the environmentalist cause has been kind of whitewashed. So there's this idea that those who are actually pushing green ideas or any type of environment-friendly type of ideas tend to be actually Western partners going to Asia, Latin America, or Africa, and then teaching them the green ways. And we can also see that even in our consumption of bioproducts in Europe, that tends to be very much class related. So those who can afford to eat well will then be granted the pleasure of saving the planet while doing so. And his entire point was actually to talk about how this is a form of extension of class and racial issues in where we think about environmental concerns, even though the first one who were actually impacted by them tended to be browns and blacks of this world of all genders. And so we can see that, for example, if we look into many of the crises in the Middle East, or we can think about migration waves in the 1970s, 1980s from the Sahel to Europe. Those were actually environmental crises that led people to basically flee their region of origin. And so just to say that being aware of environmental problems did not occur in 2025. It's something that was deeply rooted in communities and actually was very much materially expressed and lived, which is a point that Namatai was making earlier, this idea that there's something that is very concrete, something very material about the implications of the type of futures that we produce or the type of futures that we choose to see or not to see. Now, on the basis of that critique of saying that there is something about the way we frame ecology that tends to reproduce colonial structures, his proposal could have been to say, then let's look into those ancestral ways. So let's go back to indigenous ways of different parts of the world, or let's learn from the modern ways that are proposed by the existing green-based system. But he chose to do none of the two. And that was not to say that none of those two had anything to say about fighting the environmental crisis that we're on. His point was actually to look into a point of encounter. And so his proposal was to go into what he has called the maroonage in French. And so maroons are basically formerly enslaved peoples who basically fled slavery and hid basically in nature with the help of knowledges that were actually coming from indigenous groups as well in the Americas. And so what was quite interesting was to see how his very point was to look into this place of encounter, saying, wait a minute, there's been people before who were in nature and had that situation of living in a hostile environment and still needed to be freed, because between a hostile environment and slavery, they were still going to choose the hostile environment, which is very telling about humanity when you're like, I prefer anything but the species I'm in. But in any case, what was really interesting about that case, and I think speaks beautifully to Franziska's point, building on Namatai's point, which is how to be prepared for hostility. I would say that there's something that we can learn directly from feminist movements, from decolonial movements, from the oppressed movement, from subaltern movements, any movement that was led by people who have been used to living in hostile environments. Because from a place of hostility, there is knowledge. And so I definitely believe that this is a strong feminist message that definitely fuels our practice.
And there's it is really a paradox, isn't it? So to Franziska's point earlier, at the same time that we need a unifying message, we also need to acknowledge all the differences and the different perspectives and angles. We don't want to use like a universalizing approach that erases all the differences. We've been through that before. But at the same time, if you are super nuanced and I don't know, academic and specific, who are we reaching, right? And I think one thing that the anti-rights movements do really well, unfortunately, is they have very simple and simplistic messages that are full of effect, and that just connect with so many people. So I'm always curious to see, like, how do we navigate narrative and language and examples so that we bring more people on board? Because I don't know, I don't believe that we have so many mean people in the world. You know, I think there are a lot of people who are leaning towards anti-rights and you know, super right movement, and it's not necessarily so deliberate, you know, but it's a message that is very easy to understand and to catch. But I'm curious to see, where do you navigate this in your mind and internally and in the world? Whoever wants to.
Is Namatai back? Just in
Yes,
case.
I am. I had been booted out by my network, but now I'm back. So I think I would just connect it with the question that has been asked with regards to the simplistic language that you know, anti-rights movements are using. So I think the simplistic language is deeply rooted in a deep culture of disinformation and misinformation. You know, patriarchal propaganda is actually a thing, and it distorts the public's perception on the feminist movements, often framing them as harmful, radical, and dangerous. So I mean, the false claims that about feminism leading to the breakdown of families, the marginalization of men, the distortions about issues of abortion, misinterpreting transgender rights, etc. All of those things are part of the strong disinformation campaign and narrative peddling. And mind you, they have excellent spin masters, spin doctors who are really good at spinning narratives. So I think what really is effective on the mass psychological operation they conduct on broader civilization is the fact that it has rewards. So people that are seen to get along with the strongly patriarchal narratives do get such social points. They are generally perceived as principled, as people that are admirable, but also people that are worth respecting. And people who go against this then are punished. So there is also a system of punishments for people who go against the narratives that they spread. So they are perceived as not worthy of respect. They also experience a lot of systemic and structural violence, but are also in many ways isolated from the broader community, and especially if they're women. So I think that particular narrative peddling and misinformation also finds itself in very vicious and violent labels, and also vicious and violent narrative peddling. So I mean, the framing of feminists as men haters, radicals, anti-family, creates an environment of hostility and suspicion. Narrative peddling by far right media outlets, social media politicians, frequently deploys misleading narratives about feminism and undermine legitimacy and gender equality movements. So these are the harsh realities of like how these people function. I think this has also now informed a lot of like funding, as we have seen, which is also something very systemic and very tactical that is happening to remove resources from the feminist movements. So defunding feminist organizations and gender equality groups at national and international levels is something that we've seen. And I think a lot of progressive players that, you know, in the past were extremely progressive, like the Dutch, for instance. The Dutch, I was shocked reading their new approach to funding internationally, in which they are cutting all resources directed towards gender equality programs, feminist programs. So this is just how bad it is. And at the time where they are, you know, because of these narratives, taking out resources from the feminist movement, they are increasing a lot of capital for the anti-feminist movement, because the anti-gender, anti-feminist movement is very much well-funded. So we must understand that it's a deeply embedded problem that has a lot of systemic and structural violence, and that is also peddled in terms of sanitizing that systemic and structural violence. So the anti-gender and anti-feminist movement is violent from the place of, you know, economic violence, from the place of political violence, from the place of even violence in the healthcare system. There will be now a significant lack of access for reproductive health services for women, such as abortion and contraception. And these are things that we actually have to consider because they are taking away aspects of our autonomy on our bodies, the ability to make choices about our bodies. So in as much as we can have this conversation at a very global, sometimes regional and even national level, we also need to really atomize it and go down to what is deeply personal, because the personal is very political, because these rights are being taken at a very personal level. So I have more points, but I would like to allow others to speak. And maybe I could just come in a little bit with some of my thinkings around what we can do to build a feminist future. But I'll just round it off by saying that at a very personal level in the world, we will experience in this time an increase in domestic violence, sexual harassment, and femicides, which are very symptomatic of a patriarchal system that has become upset that they have been losing privilege, given a lot of the gains that the feminist movement has made along the way. The radical far-right shift is an affirmation of all of the efforts that feminists of past and of present have made towards ensuring that women have a better place and a better position in the world. And because now men, in particular powerful men, are being told to move over, and especially those ones that are especially mediocre, are finding that it is now becoming harder in the world to show up. There is also a reaction to that, because for many who have been privileged, the loss of privilege is seen as something that's unfair. And men historically have always had that. So I think it's really a critical conversation about these issues to understand why this backlash, but also to understand how disinformation and misinformation plays a part in fueling this backlash. I'll stop here for now.
This Eva or Franziska would like to comment.
I would like just to mirror that. For me, I absolutely share what Namatai just pointed out as structural critique. Like it's a shift of fundings, it's a systemic approach we must talk about. But from a personal point of view, I sometimes feel a bit freezed by all of the global threats, and my question as a person, as a human being, as a female futurist whatsoever, would be what can we do, like of small steps, what can I do to kind of handle my freezeness, my my overwhelming sort of and I don't think you've mentioned it before. I co-founded with 6 other women, like the first German network for female futurists in Germany. And this is like just one tiny step to make their very diverse work in the futures field a bit more visible. So to kind of say, okay, there is no such thing as like one topic of a female futurist, but it's a plurality of this. And what we try to do, and this is, I kind of, I can say like it's a small step, is to provide small spaces to exchange ideas, to speak about our fears, to speak about ideas at female futurists, to be able to have a non-academic conversation as well as the academic ones. So to kind of have diverse approaches and make their diverse work more visible from the inside, but to the outside as well. Because in Germany, it's the same as in every other country, I believe, that it's a field dominated by a white man, more or less, the futures field. And if you kind of portray a female futurist, it's all about care work, but it's not like one single story when it comes to female futurists. They have diverse topics. What I wanted to, because it's an open question I have in my mind, is how can we stay resilient in times of being threatened all the time as females, as futurists, as feminists, as human beings? Because I find it kind of challenging to stay in the political and the critique, and at the same time stay healthy. Yeah, that was my point.
So Franziska, might I just request to speak because I would have to jump out. So I just want to exhaust my points. I have got this written down, so I will share with you what I had written down. So my last point was on reimagining a feminist future and building power and resilience. So we are moving in the same energy right now. So I wanted to say that the first thing that I believe is essential in reimagining a feminist future and building power and resilience is understanding power dynamics and how they exist. And this is also a conversation around feminist power literacy. So feminist power literacy is this ability by feminists to be able to read power, because only when we are able to read power are we able to write power, and are we able to make an audit of what is our own power, what is their power, and how do we deploy our own power to ensure that we gain more ground for the feminist movement. And understanding this power literacy, feminist power literacy, it starts off at a very personal and individual level. It starts off in the private before it goes into the public. Because the point of insistence with patriarchy is to insist on being able to have power and domination over the female and people who are otherwise not male within the private space before they even make it to the public space. So understanding the power dynamics is essential, and how to leverage existing resources is essential in fighting for feminist futures. Effective strategies, knowing how to navigate what is political, economic, social, and power structures is critical in achieving meaningful change. I'll give you an example. I've got a friend of mine who told me that if you were to run for office and you present yourself as a feminist, no one would vote for you. But you could wear the feminist values inside you and not identify publicly, but you're able to use those feminist values once you're in power. So that's a strategy. So we need to also have an understanding of, should we be loud at this moment, or should we be a little bit quiet, but employ other ways of showing up, depending on the situation at hand. The next thing that we have to do is to build power. And building power for feminist futures is around building coalitions and strengthening the feminist movement. Increasing political, economic, and social cost for the anti-feminist forces can only happen when we build power. So the people that are going against the feminist movement must not go so without any recourse or any cost. There has to be a political, social, and economic cost for going against the feminist movement. And it starts when we organize, when we demand accountability, and we push back against retrogressive policies that are trying to reverse the gains of the feminist movement. And they literally have to feel the costs. They have to feel the cost of losing political power. They have to feel the cost of losing economic power. And if it might not happen in a day or two, but we have to consistently organize and build power so that they know this will not go unchallenged. The next thing is to build resilient feminist movements that can withstand backlash. And this is a conversation that speaks into mental well-being and wellness as we challenge patriarchy because it's quite violent, but also having intersectional activism that recognizes marginalized voices, because then it means that there are more people who are going to show up as we build these resilient movements. Building resilient feminist movements is essential now at this particular time, because we will experience less funding than we have ever experienced. We will also experience a lot of labeling, a lot of negative labeling. How do we re-enter society and re-educate society about what feminism is, even when you're dealing with people that have been radicalized against feminism? So that also requires us to build resilience. And sometimes resilience also means putting in place protection mechanisms for feminists, ensuring that they also are taken care of, especially in instances where they are physically threatened, because I think sometimes things get ugly and people can actually lose their lives. Then the final point that I have on rethinking feminist futures is defending our gains through solidarity with other movements. The anti-racist movement, the climate movement. We can also have solidarity to defend our gains in those movements as well, and to create a unified front that sees the intersectional aspects of what we are fighting for as feminists in other broader movements. Finally, it is to rethink strategic resource mobilization so that we're able to defend reproductive health rights, gender equality, and we also go against discrimination laws. So these are all the points that I have with regards to rethinking feminist futures and also building power and resilience. I will share my points with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Namatai. Very important point. I know you had to leave early for another commitment, so feel free to leave when you need. We only have 10 more minutes for this. I would like to hear Eva on this point, and then open to potential questions that may come up in the chat. Eva, to you.
I'll keep it brief, but it can of course extend either after this chat or anytime soon. I wanted to go back to 2 points that had been made. There was one that was Thays' question in terms of, how do we get into some of those conversations that can be difficult conversations? And then there's a second question that was more about the strategy as like the different actors. Right now, it is true that considering our political and economic situation for a variety of different reasons, we have to change our strategy. I'll start with the last point, actually. Once again, I do not necessarily believe that we are in a new time. I understand that it's new to us in our physical material experience, but it's not new to basically the struggle of different forms. And so my response will reflect that. The work that I've been doing was targeting for a variety of different reasons, mainly African communities, because I'm also of Cameroonian descent. Now, I remember one of our latest projects that was in another country in Western Africa, and it was quite interesting to see that gender was seen as as a prize by many development organizations. And so it was easier actually to get funding because it was gender framed. The problem is the way gender was actually thought by those actors was very different from the type of gender problems that we got to see on site and that people actually were seeing themselves. And so around this matter of funding, this idea that we are dictated to do things in the direction of a particular donor is not new. And so we'll just adapt to what was on the go. I'll give you what we've done for that particular project, and you can actually suspect how we could do that in a context where projects that indicate women or any forms of underrepresented groups do not get funding, then obviously we play around that. That's called coping. It doesn't mean that it's great, but it's what we need to do. So in that particular project that we had, we used the broadest definition possible around this idea of women. Our point was actually we were certain that by interrogating, like getting to talk to particular women in that country, we could get a sense of the particular, again, going to this idea of the urgency of the particular. But our point was never to say that it was necessarily a women thing, and so that we could only get to learn from women. But so we framed it in a way that was interesting for the donor. So this idea that we would be in contact with a series of different women coming from different locations in the country, from rural area, from urban areas, from semi-urban type of areas. So kind of filling out those different ideas of, the results-based framework, the different KPIs that we're supposed to do for those type of projects. But then our ideas were already there from the start. And so we were able to then have participants who were also not necessarily women, have participants who could actually speak to some of the issues that were raised around the relationship to marriages or the relationship to knowledge production from their own standpoint. So it was important for us to know what were the values that we had, and then to kind of have this schizophrenic type of relationship to donors where we would say one thing and then we would do another. And this is not comfortable. I would obviously recommend maybe doing something else if we could, but when we cannot, obviously being agile is of course a necessity. It's not only desired, it's a dire need if you want to get funding. A second point was around this idea of what do we do when some conversations are difficult to be had. And here that would be maybe a point that I want to make very clear to all the feminists in the room, which is that it's not because a conversation can be had or even sometimes should be had that we will have it. And it's important for us sometimes to be able to back off. I see that in various instances where there's a series of good intentions in the room, or about leading particular conversations. There's, for example, some tension that we may need to talk about at some point when we have discussions on gender relations and actually also non-binary relations in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, that are led by white European actors using terminologies that only make sense to their ecosystem. And so the problem is, it's not that the conversation that they wish for the people to have is not important or should not take place. It's just that the frame that is set for it is not necessarily conducive to a conversation. And so we have a situation where it actually leads people to backing off while they may be the primary target or be the ones who may actually respond positively. And so this idea of starting from where people are at implies getting a sense of what debates can actually take place and how. What are the terms that speak to the people? And once again, it requires some forms of relatability. What makes sense to you? It could be a matter of language. It could be a matter of different imaginaries. What is seeking a point of connection rather than just imposing an agenda? Because nobody appreciates getting an agenda imposed on themselves. And that is true for you in the room. That's true for me. So if we actually have to put ourselves in a situation where we have a conversation with other people, it's really important for us to actually start from that standpoint. What would be a place of appreciation that we can actually start from?
We have one question here from Clara, and then we have to finish, unfortunately. I'll ask you to be very brief in your response. Clara is asking, what is one key practice you always incorporate into your futures work to bring in multiple feminist perspectives? One key practice that you incorporate in your futures work. Namatai already left. Franziska, you unmuted yourself.
I'd say maybe it's not like one key practice, but it's an attitude somehow. Maybe the possibility to be wrong. So to not know everything before I start a conversation, to have more questions than answers, to really practice active listening, to be able to have ambiguous thoughts and not just this right or wrong or left and right, to stay open, sort of. And maybe to give myself time to grow and to give the person I talk to. Sorry, I was distracted by the chat. Like, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Eva, what about you?
I don't have a one go-to, so I will not be able to give that manual idea. I know that I would love to help you on that one, but I won't be able to help you that way. Because it depends on the people that you have in the room. I would say maybe in terms of techniques, in terms of making sure that we all alert. There's one thing that is actually, it was Sohail who told me that story, but it's too long a story to tell you now, considering the time that I have at our disposal. But it was about basically addressing the tension that was in the room. So it was a situation where his identity was a problem in the room. And he knew. And so rather than just like glimpsing over it, he decided to actually talk about it so that people had a space to address it. And so here it could be about it was his identity for a variety of different reasons, but I think it can resonate with us in many different ways. Situation where you work with groups that have very little to do with what you're doing. Maybe you're working with bankers and you actually, I don't know, usually focus on gardening flowers. Well, you need to also address that at times. So, you know, as a way to make it so that you can connect with people once again. This question around using alternative words to feminism, I would first need to know what does not resonate with you, Dr. Claire, in order to then know what alternatives we may propose. But I think it's like anything, the same way for futures at times I don't use the word in my own practice, even if it's about futures, then I can see why there may be a situation where you choose to use another terminology. But I first need to know why in order to then propose a how.
Thank you for answering that. Just very briefly, I think that because of my, I guess how I grew up in Jamaica, the word feminism feels like a very white female construct. To come back to what you said about the people who were formerly enslaved, I don't think that it's a universal term. And I have had friends from Africa who have said that by borrowing that terminology and bringing it to Africa, it actually forced them to give up some of the powers that they had. In certain tribes, for example, where women had certain responsibilities. And so the backlash was because it's not a patriarchy or a feminism. It should be a balance. And so there needs to be a new terminology. I have very strong concerns about what is a feminist future. What we need is a balanced future. We are saying that for us to be fully human, all people have to have a seat at the table. And so I think we have to go and dig a bit further. And this is how we are deconstructing patriarchy. Also looking very hard at what the sort of anti-masculine or anti-male perspective of the feminist movement, how that has also created more hostility than we needed to create. So it's just an opportunity right now, especially here in America, to really rethink the terms and see if there's some new terms we might birth to still get the point across. It's not the idea, but if the terms are really being made toxic, you really can't detoxify them. Let's look for something new and move forward and evolve to a higher level, a higher consciousness.
I hear you. I think it requires a longer conversation. I think the short answer I will give you is I don't think any type of feminist, decolonial, or any type of frameworks that may exist that responds to what you're addressing is about holding on to one word. That being said, it should not prevent us from also acknowledging the power of words. And so there is a tension in that we should respect. So if there is something about the word feminism that is seen as scary, there's something that should also be addressed. So my point is not necessarily that you need to hold on to it, but it's also important to know why it creates those type of emotions, because those should then also potentially be addressed.
It's a longer question, but this whole issue of racism is very much a part of it. So we really have to spend some time. If we're going to make allies, especially again in the US context, we have to make allies across race and gender. And in the US context, it certainly is not a given that many of the women that I work with in the Black movement right now feel very comfortable also with the term feminism because of their experience in the workplace with white women. So I'm just saying we know we have to work differently and we believe in the same things, but how can we find a way to move forward? So all of the theories are good, but if we have a block that doesn't allow us to move forward, can we find a new word that allows room for that to be acknowledged? So we have to do some work, I think.
Totally agree that we have to keep talking about this.
Yeah.
Milagros is also saying here in the chat that we should have another meeting. Let's arrange that soon. It's a
Yes,
shame
it'll
that
be
our
good.
time
I
is.
think it'll be useful,
Yeah.
especially here in America. We need to
Yeah.
find at this point some common words that allow us to do this cross-border and transboundary and everything as dialogues and create these movements that are, So I would love to have another opportunity.
Let's make that happen. Thank you so much, Eva and Franziska, and also Namatai, who's no longer in this room, but was fantastic to count on your perspectives and wisdom and knowledge. It was brilliant to listen to all of you.